Hi, if we haven't met before, my name's Dan and I'm a CMAP qualified mortgage and protection advisor. This video is purely for educational purposes only and should not be seen as advice or a recommendation to act. I want to share with you part of a webinar I sat in on. It's a story shared by a fellow mortgage and protection advisor, Stephen Giles, who went through a personal experience of mouth and throat cancer and how important he felt the insurance was to him. The video is around 16 minutes long, but it is a very moving story which he has very kindly let me share with you, so thank you, Stephen. As I've already mentioned, I'm not advising you to take this particular type of insurance, but I want to highlight the importance of speaking to an advisor such as myself to get the advice. Here is Stephen's story.
Thank you very much. As Gary said, I spent 7 years as an anaesthetic technician working in many different operating theatres: open heart surgery, paediatrics, gynecology, general surgery, and actually ENT, which I was going to encounter at some future stage in my life. I started in the insurance industry when I was 25, which was 35 years ago. And from day one, I think primarily because of the situations I'd seen people in medically when I worked in the theatre, I've always written volume protection business. I believe very strongly in protecting what you have, as in your family, as in your home, as in your income. So consistently I'd written volume business, and I have no issue in doing that. I introduced that very, very early into my presentation, i.e. the first couple of minutes a client calls for an appointment, we will talk about the mortgage, but we'll also talk about protection. As Gary said, I worked with Home of Choice, who later became First Complete. I was there for 10 years. They're very, very proactive with regard to protection business, doing high volumes. Being incredibly modest, I was #1 in the country for them on a number of occasions, writing £400, £500, £600 a week in premiums for life, critical illness and income protection. I've done that consistently. So I have a background of writing protection. I have a background of effectively, should we say, the effects medically have on people with regard to their lives, their income, and so on. Fast forward to 2017, my apologies, 2016, September, October. I've always been a very keen cyclist since I was the age of 10. I rode on the British team when I was 17, 18, 19, the World Championships reserve in Venezuela, when a guy called Greg LeMond, who won the Tour de France 3 times, won them there. So I was at a reasonably high standard, so used to being quite fit. I've always kept myself fit. I eat good food. I train 4 times a week. And I've never smoked in my life, and because of my training when I was younger, I never actually drank alcohol, so no reason to suspect that anything was going to happen to me. We went cycling to Spain, a group of us, as we do 4 times a year, in November 16, did our usual 240, 250 miles over a 4-day period, and flew back end of November into December 16, and I got off the plane and I had a cough, and a cough was all I had. And the cough started and the cough continued and the cough wouldn't go away. 2 weeks later, encouraged my girlfriend, who is now my wife, we'd been together for 20 years, encouraged me to go to the doctors, who prescribed me with some antibiotics and take these for 2 weeks and you won't have a cough anymore. I took them for 2 weeks and my cough was worse than ever. I left it, completely ignored it, and carried on coughing through Christmas, and got between Christmas and New Year. 28th of December, we're going to a friend's birthday party, and Vicky said, "You need to go to the doctors again." And I said, "I'll go next week." So she said, "No, you're doing them now." I went to the doctors again for some more antibiotics, and they said, "No, you can't have some, you need to go and see an ENT specialist," which I did the following week. Unfortunately, he had to put a camera up my nose, which was the most horrific experience and certainly brings tears to your eyes. And his exact words were, "Your right tonsil is swollen and we'd better have this taken out," as he said, to make sure it's nothing more sinister. I can remember his words quite clearly. The following week, I went into the hospital to have my tonsil taken out. I put under the anaesthetic, used to be on the other end of it, albeit many years ago. Woke up and taken back to the room and quite drowsy, probably drowsing for an hour, 2 hours, something of that sort. Lovely lady doctor came in with a nurse, and as they're sort of partly awake, partly asleep, said, "We need to bring you up to speed with where you are with your tonsillectomy." And her words to me were, "We couldn't take your tonsil out because you've got cancer of the mouth and the throat." And I'm thinking, I'm still dreaming from the anaesthetic. You're in the wrong room, because this doesn't happen to me. You've surely mistaken me for somebody else. So "you've got cancer of the mouth and the throat" was the one sentence that changed my life quite dramatically and very, very quickly. Essentially, with this, I think somebody tells you got cancer and you imagine you're going to die in a week's time. I had a grade 4 tumour at the back of my throat that had grown from my tonsil into the side of my soft palate. And if the tumour, as I understand it, had been on my arm, they would have operated and taken the tumour off my arm and everything would have been fine. I called a client of mine who's a consultant oncologist but specialising in liver treatment, and explained to him what had happened. And his words to me, as it reminded me when we met for coffee last year, were, "Prepare to go through hell." And from that point on, for the next 28 days, I went to the hospital 25 times. I had a critical illness policy in place with Aviva for around about £357,000. I had an income protection policy in place for just short of £5,000 a month, also with Aviva. The first thing, believe me, that comes to your mind is, where did I put that policy? I need to ring them straight away. I called Aviva, went through the motions, and they registered my claim. The next day I went to the hospital, and the day after that I went to the hospital, and the day after that I went to the hospital. And I carried on going to the hospital for pretty much most of the next month. Because my tumour was at the back of my mouth and into my throat, the preparation that had to be done for my treatment took around 2 months. I went for maxillofacial consultation on the basis that if they needed to take any of my teeth out, if I had any dental problems, that had to be done before my treatment started. Quite simply, they're going to damage the blood supply to your mouth and your jaw so much with radiotherapy. I take it I'm still here. So much with radiotherapy, they have to essentially do any treatment before then. The picture shown is my personalised face mask that was melted onto my face. That's made out of Kevlar. I had that every morning for 30 minutes for 30 days, and my head was bolted to the table. The green line is the area of trace for the radiation to be directed towards my throat to essentially burn the tumour out of my mouth. It's a bit like having a barbecue started at the back of your throat. It's quite an interesting situation. When that mask was on, I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't breathe very well. It's a dimpled Kevlar substance, and my face was covered in the dimples because it's so tight. The first week I got my hair cut. The radiographer the next morning knew I'd had my hair cut, not because they could see it was a different style, but because I'd moved in the mask, so they took a plate out from underneath and fastened it down tighter. I had, as I say, 30 sessions of that to burn the tumour from my throat. On top of that, on a Wednesday, just to make it a more delightful day, I had 2¼ hours of chemotherapy on a drip. And I was saying to Gary earlier, I thought the most bizarre situation is I was in a chemotherapy unit attached to a drip for 2¼ hours with 40 other people who I had absolutely nothing in common with, other than we all had cancer. Interesting situation. I lost count of the number of hospital consultations I had with my consultant of ENT, my ENT consultant, my oncology consultant. I can't remember how many blood tests I had. There were so many of them. The consultation with the dietitian, the consultation with my Macmillan nurse, who was absolutely wonderful. I had 35 CT scans. I had 6 MRI scans. I had 2 PET CT scans, which essentially is an hour of having a radioactive substance put into you before you forego CT scan, because they'd found a patch on my spine, which they were unsure what it was. I met the dietitian. I had nasogastric tubes put in for 8-10 hours at a time. One of them, prior to my admission to the hospital, to have a feeding tube fitted into my abdomen, which was done under sedation. I wouldn't have known if I was in that theatre for 10 minutes, 10 years or 10 hours, but I came out of it with the tube coming out of my abdomen so I could be fed directly into my stomach. I'm pretty determined, as I say, by nature of my upbringing with cycling and general sport. They'd told me that 97% of people have to have the food being fed directly into the stomach. And the reason for that is because your throat is so burnt that you can't swallow at all. Your throat's blistered, you've got a gaping hole in your neck. I decided I was going to be one of the 3% who didn't be fed into the stomach, and I managed that, but it's very, very, very difficult. I had a gaping hole in the side of my neck caused by the radiation. My taste buds were burnt off, so had I wanted to eat, I wouldn't have been able to taste anything. The salivary ducts in the side and glands in the side of my mouth were burnt out, so my mouth doesn't produce any saliva on one side. So for many months, I would wake up with my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. And quite simply, the only way you can remove it is by having a glass of water and soaking your tongue off the roof of your mouth. My throat was so burnt, I used to get reflux and wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with my throat on fire. In the morning, Vicky would wake me up at 7 o'clock, so I need to go to the hospital every day at 8:30 for 6 weeks to have my throat burnt out. I started on painkillers with paracetamol 3 days in because my throat was so burnt. It was difficult and I couldn't swallow a paracetamol tablet, so my Macmillan nurse gave me paracetamol by liquid. 4 days after that, the pain was so bad that paracetamol was no good, so I started with cocodamol. They then had morphine if I needed it, but I never resorted to morphine. I decided I wasn't going to take that. So the routine in the morning, I would wake up about 7:15 and Vicky would give me quite a sizable dose of cocodamol painkiller. And I would drink that. It used to take me 17 sips to drink this because I counted every one of them. And I would drink that 15 minutes before I tried to eat a Weetabix that had been soaking in milk for 20 minutes. My throat was so burnt, it still felt like I was eating gravel. Onto the hospital, have your head bolted to the table for 20 minutes, and radiotherapy. Apart from a Wednesday, as I say, when it was 2.25 hours on a drip prior to going for radiotherapy, so Wednesday wasn't a good day. Beyond my Kevlar mask, I was admitted to hospital on the first week because I got a reaction to the chemotherapy and I was in a bit of a mess. I was admitted to a ward, a 2-bed ward, and I shared a room with a guy who was 20 years older than me who had liver cancer, and he was actually being treated by Amandeep, my client who I mentioned earlier. And that guy died 2 months later. I was with him for 4 days before he went home, and they brought a guy in who was 20 years younger than me. He came in with his daughter, who was 3, and his wife. He had pancreatic cancer. He stayed for 24 hours until they took him to the hospice. And I would be absolutely shocked if he lived for beyond 2 weeks after that at 36 years old. My experience of being in the room with those 2 guys made me grateful for what I had. I was in a bit of a state, but I wasn't in as bad a state as they were. My first visit to the hospital there as an admission, I stayed for 5 days. I had my chemotherapy in the bed because I wasn't well enough to be taken to the chemotherapy unit. My weight had dropped from 13.25 stone to 11.5 stone, and I lost that weight in 12 days. I was so weak some days that I couldn't walk up the stairs. I've done some fairly tough things in my life, and as I explained with my cycling and ridden over the Alps, the Pyrenees, ridden for the British team, believe me, nothing is as tough as radiotherapy and chemotherapy together for 6 weeks. Beyond that, I had various other issues that happened along the way, and essentially every day your throat's being burnt. I had a gaping hole burnt into my neck. As I mentioned, I had no taste buds, so I couldn't taste any food if I could eat it. The only things that I could eat primarily were yogurt, but I couldn't taste it. I could have occasional pasta, and I could have rice pudding. and I was determined I was going to carry on eating, because if I lost too much weight, I would be admitted again as an emergency into the hospital. So each day for 6 weeks, my life consisted of getting up and going to the hospital to have my throat burnt out. Apart from a special treat on a Wednesday was to have chemotherapy as well, which, as I said earlier, wasn't a particularly good day. Throughout the course of my treatment, I became weaker and weaker. They told me that it would get worse and worse throughout the time, but please don't think it'll finish after 30 days when your treatment finishes, quite simply because if you put fuel on a fire and you stop putting fuel on a fire, it doesn't burn out, it burns with greater intensity. So 30 days is really 40 days. So don't think you're going to get away with it after 30 days. My treatment finished 30 days on. Thank God for that. I can go home and I don't have to go back again for some time, some checkups. Apart from through the course of the day, I felt worse and worse, and I was so weak. And the evening, I got admitted to the hospital, and I was admitted with pneumonia, and I was in a bit of a mess, and that was when I really thought that I was going to die. I was in hospital again for 5-6 days on a drip, and in a bit of a mess, and finally came home 6-7 days later, and had improved slightly to the point where I could just walk from the car into the house. My treatment had essentially finished, but I still had no idea if the tumour had gone, and neither did they, because I couldn't have a scan for 4 months or so, until the September. And the rationale behind that was because I'd had 30 sessions of radiotherapy treatment and 30 CT scans to gauge the size of the tumour. There was so much radiation in my body that if I'd have had a scan at any point before 4 months, as they said, it would have lit up like a Christmas tree and they wouldn't be able to tell what was there anyway. So an interesting duration waiting for the result. September, I was diagnosed on 24th of January. I went back to the hospital in the September to have my scan. From the scan, you need to wait 2 weeks before you go back to get the result of this. A particularly tense time, myself and Vicky went to the hospital, and dependent upon the result of that conversation, I would either have to have surgery on my tongue, to take a portion of my tongue away and a portion of my jaw, or I wouldn't have to have anything. So to say that was a tense meeting is the world's greatest understatement. Fortunately, and touch wood, I was in the clear and in remission from September the 15th, 2017. That year, in 2017, I was off work for 251 days. I count the figures. I went to the hospital 87 times in 2017. I saved money anyway, but my critical illness policy made such a dramatic difference to the profile of treatment that I could have, in that I didn't need to worry about where the money was coming from. The guys, I had treatment with 2 guys who had a similar condition to me, and they didn't have any money. I almost felt quite guilty and felt as I should give them some, but equally everybody is there and can look after themselves or be advised to take the correct thing. They either hadn't been advised or hadn't taken it. One of them, on the day that I struggled to walk, was going to try and go back to work to pay his mortgage. And I could have been off for the next 10 years and it wouldn't have made any difference because I had the proceeds in my policy and some savings there. I've always done a lot of protection, as I said earlier, but that particularly hit home about how important it is to advise all clients that they should have adequate protection in place. If they refuse it, their choice, but at least then they've got a choice rather than giving them absolutely no choice at all.
Thank you once again, Stephen, for allowing me to share your story. As you can imagine, this is why it is important to seek professional advice. Have you ever wondered what the differences are between income protection and accident, sickness and unemployment cover? If so, I've covered that in this video. Thanks for watching. See you next week.